Hi everyone, I'm Hayes, this is Army Brownies, and this is an Undyne prosthetic, or Undyne. Well, sexy fish prosthetic. And I'm going to show you how I go about painting one of these prosthetics. I'm going to show you two different methods, both with brushes and with an airbrush. So you have the different options here. First, you have to spend a little time trimming it down. I find opening the eyes up as much as you can makes the mask more comfortable and more wearable for a longer time, especially if it's one you're buying online and isn't fitted to you. If it's made to your specifications, it'll be a little more comfortable and you can make the eyes narrower. Just keep that in mind. For both these two techniques, the very first thing we want to do is lay down a foundation. You could just straight up airbrush the entire blue over the whole thing, but mixing acrylic paint with a bit of latex creates for a much stronger, much more resilient base coat that you can then paint on. That acrylic layer creates a nicer layer for the rest of the acrylic to go on over the top of. Now you can just see me mixing in about 25% latex to fit 75% acrylic paint and just brushing over the whole thing, making sure to get in all of the details, making sure not to leave bubbles, and just covering the whole thing in one solid layer of paint. I'm using artist acrylic paint. It's called System 3. It's a very high quality paint and you could paint it directly onto the mask, but I feel adding the touch of latex gives it a little bit of extra adhesion and makes it last longer. It doesn't peel off the actual latex of the mask. But because you are mixing latex in with your paint, you have to make sure that you wash your paintbrush using water with soap or fairy liquid in it, because normal water will not dissolve the latex off the brush, and if you just leave latex on your brush, it will ruin your brush and just go through them. Eventually though, there'll be enough little bits of latex in any brush that the brush will die from using painting latex, so just expect that and don't use your best brushes for it. Now that the base is actually painted, we spend a little while just letting it dry, because the next stage is going to be dry brushing, and we need the entire base layer dry before we do anything more on it. Here's it dry. You can tell it's dry because it's no longer shiny and doesn't look wet, even though she's a fish. Our first step is to mix up a colour slightly lighter than the base colour. Now, I'm doing this without mixing in any latex this time, but we're just taking the blue acrylic and mixing a little bit of white acrylic, mixing that in on my brush, and then I wash the brush off thoroughly, dry the brush off thoroughly again, and with that dry brush, take a tiny little bit of the paint and then sweep off a fair bit of the paint, just until it feels like there's not much paint left on the brush, and then I start lightly going over the surface of my prosthetic. Because the prosthetic can be sculpted in such a way that the details are raised, because you are doing it with paint that isn't wet and doesn't run, and you're only kind of brushing the surface, the paint that is on the brush will catch on the higher areas, and that will highlight the prosthetic and bring out all the details of all of the scales on the paint, on the prosthetic, and make you look a lot more fishy. This is a process that we just slowly repeat with slightly lighter paint, and each time that we actually go over it, we are applying less and less paint. We are brushing slightly lighter. We are leaving less paint on the brush. It's an incredibly useful technique used for many different types of painting, and it takes a little while to get used to. But once you understand how it works, that you do not want your brush to be wet, hence it's called dry brushing. You want to make sure the layer below is dry as well. You'll find it's a very useful technique. Then I take a little bit of darker paint. I leave this paint semi-translucent and I paint that over the eyebrows and then kind of blend in, make it a little bit watery, make it a little bit translucent. So it sort of blends in rather than just be big cartoonish eyebrows. I wanted them to look a bit natural, and I spend a little time blending in the outside of them and then going over the other details on the mask, like the gills, the highlight of the ear fin things, just where I want to highlight that there's differentiation in the details, and that creates contrast, which is something a lot of props and costume pieces need to make them look better. Now we're going to paint the red over them. However, red and blue don't go together very well. If you paint red directly over blue, it goes incredibly dark because they don't share any common pigments. Therefore, they both absorb different types of light, and they just come out very well. So the first layer that I put down is actually almost white. I mix in a touch of red on there just to make the next layer a little bit easier. But white acrylic paint tends to be incredibly strong if you get good paint. So I'm putting down a layer of white first, and over that I paint a very strong red. Now you can see the red that goes over the top is incredibly vibrant now. If I hadn't put down the layer of white, it wouldn't come out very well. But choosing your base colours is very important for painting. It's very important for painting. And you can see I've also just used that same white paint to paint her fangs. There's a couple of layers of red that go on just to make it nice and vibrant, and there you go. You can see how the scale effect has been highlighted by the dry brushing, how it's all kind of brought out, and that, once it's dried, is almost a finished painted prosthetic. But first, we want to seal it to hold all of the paint onto it. Now, Prosthetic is a fantastic, flexible prop sealant. Some varnishes and some sealants will crack and try and peel off and such, whereas Prosthetic is stretchy enough that it can stretch along with the latex and hold the paint underneath it on and protect the paint job. And there you go. This also has the benefit of mattifying the paint, so it looks more natural rather than looking like some acrylic paints come out as glossy. And there we go. Thoroughly happy with that. Looks quite good. Damn, that's a sexy fish. Now we move on to the airbrush portion, and this time I'm starting with the mask being undercoated, but I'm leaving the undercoat wet in the same way that we mix in a little bit of latex to our acrylic paint at the start. Leaving it wet allows the paint that we're about to spray on to soak into the first layer of the mask and therefore adhere a lot better, because sometimes you can find acrylic ink, as you're using in an airbrush, or as I'm using in this airbrush, will sometimes crack off because it sets hard. Now, our first layer through the airbrush is a nice uniform light colour that will go over the whole thing, and actually the areas we want to be lighter and bring out the cheekbones and the front of the face and build up some contrast for a second, where we go over it with a slightly darker blue to create contrast. We want those to be underneath the cheeks, around the nose, underneath the eyebrows and around the ear fronds. And then we do something kind of akin to dry brushing, where we, at an angle, try and catch the back of the scale details with our darker blue. And as we do that, we can build up the contrast between the details of the scales and the lighter colour we've just put on. But then we can use that same dark colour to paint the gills around the nose. Between changing colours, I always make sure to clean my airbrush thoroughly. This isn't a tutorial about how to use an airbrush, and if you're looking for advice on using an airbrush, I'm probably not the best person to go to. Then for the red, like before, we put down a base layer of white, because even though airbrush paint tends to come through a lot stronger, red on blue is still not a good mix. So I put down the white, and then, just as before, go over with 1 or 2 layers of red over the top of that, being careful not to spray too aggressively over different parts. And you can see how this creates a nice sort of more natural gradient than just the severe lines that you get at the edge of having painted it with a paintbrush. And then I decide the eyebrows aren't defined enough, so I quickly get my dark blue back in my airbrush and define those a bit more. And then, just as before, we let it dry, undercoat it with some Prosthetic, which takes away a lot of the shine, and that is our finished airbrush fish. So, I hope this has been instructional. I hope this has inspired you to try some of this yourself. And, of course, that begs the biggest question: who wore it better, airbrush or paintbrush? Give me the comments down below, and be sure to like, comment on which one you think is better, and subscribe to the channel to see more content like this, and somewhere down the line to see this prosthetic being applied. Thanks!